The altitude indicator read 7,000 feet as Major Thomas Power watched the city below transform into an ocean of fire. It was 3:30 in the morning on March 10, 1945, and Tokyo was burning with an intensity that defied human comprehension. Through the plexiglass nose of his B-29 Superfortress, Power could see flames climbing so high they threatened to engulf the bombers, still making their runs. The heat rising from the inferno below created turbulence so violent it tossed the massive aircraft like leaves in a windstorm. And this was just the beginning. Below him, in a district called Shitamachi, 16 square miles of urban landscape were being systematically erased from existence. Not by high-explosive bombs dropped from the stratosphere through radar scopes and oxygen masks, not by the precision daylight raids that had characterized American bombing doctrine since the beginning of the war. This was something else entirely. This was 334 B-29 bombers, flying lower than anyone thought possible, each carrying 7 tons of incendiary weapons, specifically designed to turn wood and paper cities into crematoriums. And the Japanese people watching those aircraft approach had no idea what was about to happen to them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how 16 square miles of Tokyo disappeared in a single night is not simply about bombs or technology, or even about the terrible arithmetic of total war. It is about the moment when American air doctrine underwent its most controversial transformation. It is about a decision that would haunt the men who made it for the rest of their lives. And it is about what happens when strategic bombing stops pretending to be about factories and railroads and admits what it has always been: an attempt to break the will of an entire population by making their homes unlivable and their continued resistance unbearable. To understand March 10th, 1945, you must first understand that this raid represented the complete abandonment of everything the United States Army Air Forces had claimed to believe about strategic bombing. For years, American air power theorists had distinguished themselves from the British by insisting on precision attacks against military and industrial targets. While the Royal Air Force burned German cities at night, the Americans dropped their bombs by day, aiming at specific factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks. This was not mercy. It was doctrine. The Americans believed that precision bombing was simply more effective than area attacks. Destroy the enemy's ability to make war, the theory went, and you would win without having to deliberately target civilian populations. The B-29 Superfortress had been designed with this philosophy in mind. It was the most sophisticated bomber ever built, capable of flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft fire and fighter interceptors. Its pressurized cabin meant crews could operate in the thin air of the stratosphere without bulky oxygen equipment. And crucially, it carried the APQ-13 radar system, which allowed bombardiers to identify targets through cloud cover and darkness. The B-29 represented more than $3 billion of research and development, the most expensive weapons program of the entire war, exceeding even the Manhattan Project. It was built to be a precision instrument, but by early 1945, precision was failing. The XXI Bomber Command, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, had been conducting high-altitude daylight raids against Japanese industrial targets since November of 1944. The results had been catastrophic, but not for the Japanese. Flying at altitudes between 25,000 and 33,000 feet, the B-29 seconds encountered weather conditions unlike anything American planners had anticipated. The jet stream, a river of wind racing across the Pacific at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, made accurate bombing virtually impossible. Bombardiers found their carefully calculated drops scattered across miles of countryside. Even when radar could identify targets through the cloud cover that blanketed Japan for much of the year, the bombs themselves fell wild, pushed off course by winds that turned precision aiming into an exercise in futility. The losses were mounting, not primarily from enemy action, though Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire took their toll. The B-29 seconds were losing engines to the extreme cold at high altitude. The massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, were prone to overheating and catching fire. Maintenance crews on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam worked around the clock, but the mechanical failure rate remained dangerously high. Crews were flying 13-hour missions to Japan and back, often with engines failing over the ocean, praying they could make it to emergency landing strips on Iwo Jima or limping home on 3 engines, sometimes 2. And for what? The reconnaissance photographs told a grim story. Japanese war production was continuing. The carefully targeted factories showed minimal damage. The strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to bring Japan to its knees was instead demonstrating the limits of precision warfare. Something had to change. That something was Curtis LeMay. In January of 1945, General LeMay took command of XXI Bomber Command. He was 38 years old, a cigar-chomping officer who had earned his reputation over Europe, where he had pioneered formation flying techniques that increased bombing accuracy while reducing losses. LeMay looked at the situation in the Pacific and came to a radical conclusion: everything the Air Forces believed about strategic bombing in Japan was wrong. The problem, LeMay determined, was not primarily mechanical or meteorological. The problem was that American bombers were trying to fight a European war in an Asian theater. German cities were built of stone and concrete. German industry was concentrated in large, easily identifiable factories. Japanese cities were different. They were largely constructed of wood and paper, and Japanese industry was not concentrated in a few massive plants, but dispersed throughout urban areas in thousands of small workshops and cottage industries. Workers assembled aircraft components in shops that sat next to their homes. War material was produced in neighborhoods that were indistinguishable from residential areas because they were residential areas. LeMay's conclusion was as simple as it was horrifying. If Japanese war production was embedded in the urban fabric itself, then the urban fabric had to be destroyed, not as collateral damage in the pursuit of specific targets, but as the target itself. And the weapon for this mission would not be high-explosive bombs but incendiaries, firebombs. Weapons specifically designed to start uncontrollable urban conflagrations. The British had been doing this to Germany for years. The firestorm raids on Hamburg in July of 1943 had killed over 40,000 people in a single week. Dresden, just weeks before LeMay took command in the Pacific, had been reduced to ruins in a massive incendiary attack. But those were British operations, conducted by night, and the Americans had always maintained a rhetorical distance from such tactics. American bombers hit factories, they insisted, not cities. Except now, Curtis LeMay was preparing to abandon that distinction entirely. The incendiary weapon LeMay planned to use was called the M69. It was a 6-pound cluster of hexagonal magnesium tubes filled with napalm, a jellied gasoline that had been developed specifically to enhance the fire-starting capability of air-dropped weapons. Each B-29 would carry not tons of high explosive but over 1,500 individual M69 bomblets, packed into larger cluster assemblies that would open at altitude, scattering the smaller bombs across a wide area. When they hit, they would burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite wood, paper, and cloth instantly, and they would be nearly impossible to extinguish. But LeMay's plan was even more radical than simply switching from explosive to incendiary weapons. He was going to send his bombers in low, not at 30,000 feet, where they were safe from most anti-aircraft fire but useless for accurate bombing. He was going to strip out most of their defensive armament to increase bomb load and fuel efficiency, and he was going to send them at night, individually rather than in formation, each aircraft making its own bombing run at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. This was insane by every conventional measure. B-29 seconds had never operated this way. Flying low and alone made them vulnerable to every anti-aircraft gun in the Japanese arsenal. Removing defensive weapons meant they would be helpless against night fighters. And night bombing had always been considered less accurate than daylight operations. Everything about the plan violated established doctrine, but LeMay had done his research. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were concentrated at high altitude. The Japanese had been preparing to fight American bombers coming in at 25,000 feet, not 7,000. Japanese night fighter capability was limited, their radar network incomplete. And accuracy, LeMay argued, was irrelevant when your target was not a specific factory but an entire urban district. You did not need precision when you were trying to start a firestorm. The target LeMay selected for his first experimental raid was Tokyo, specifically the Shitamachi district on the eastern side of the city, downwind from the Imperial Palace. Shitamachi was one of the most densely populated urban areas on Earth. Over 1 million people lived in approximately 16 square miles, crammed into wooden houses that sat so close together you could barely walk between them. The district contained thousands of small manufacturing facilities, but it was also home to working-class families, the craftsmen and laborers who formed the backbone of Tokyo's population. Intelligence estimates suggested that destroying Shitamachi would eliminate 18% of Tokyo's industrial area and 25% of its commercial sector. They did not emphasize that it would also make homeless or kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. LeMay scheduled the raid for the night of March 9th to 10th. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies over Tokyo with moderate winds from the northwest, perfect conditions for what he had in mind. He briefed his wing commanders personally, explaining the new tactics: low altitude, night operations, maximum incendiary load, strip the defensive guns. Some of the officers objected, arguing that they were sending their men on suicide missions. LeMay's response was characteristically blunt. Losses would be acceptable if they achieved results. The raids at high altitude were accomplishing nothing. This would work, or they would find something else that did. But the status quo was unacceptable. The air crews received their briefing on the afternoon of March 9th. When they learned they would be flying at 7,000 feet without most of their defensive weapons, many thought it was a death sentence. Bomber crews were trained to stay high, to use altitude as protection. Flying low meant flying into the concentrated anti-aircraft fire that had been ineffective at 30,000 feet but would be devastating at 7. And removing the guns meant they would be defenseless if Japanese fighters found them in the dark. But there was another emotion mixed with the fear: frustration. These crews had been flying mission after mission, watching their bombs scatter uselessly across the Japanese countryside, knowing that every failed raid meant the war would last longer, that more of their friends would die either over Japan or in a potential invasion of the home islands. If LeMay's new tactics could actually damage Japan's war-making ability, maybe it was worth the risk. The first B-29 lifted off from Guam at 5:36 in the evening on March 9th. Over the next 2 hours, 325 more aircraft took off from Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, forming a stream of bombers that stretched across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. Each aircraft carried approximately 7 tons of M69 incendiary clusters. The total load was nearly 2,000 tons of firebombs, more incendiary weapons than had been dropped on any single city in the history of warfare. The navigators plotted courses that would bring them to Tokyo from different directions, preventing the kind of concentrated approach that would allow Japanese defenses to focus their fire. The aircraft flew individually, not in the tight formations that had characterized daylight raids. Each crew was alone in the darkness, navigating by radar and dead reckoning across 1,500 miles of open ocean. The lead Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo at 12:15 in the morning on March 10th. Their mission was to mark the target area with incendiary bombs arranged in a giant flaming X, providing a visual aiming point for the bombers that would follow. The Pathfinders carried a different payload than the main force: M47 incendiaries, larger bombs that burned with intense white light, designed to be visible from miles away. From 7,000 feet, the Pathfinder crews could see Tokyo spread out beneath them like a field of stars, the blackout regulations creating patches of darkness, broken by scattered lights. The Sumida River curved through the eastern part of the city, a dark ribbon that would serve as a navigation reference. The bombardiers made their runs, and the first incendiaries fell at 12:15 exactly. The M47s hit the ground in the northern part of Shitamachi and ignited immediately. Within minutes, fires were burning in a pattern that spelled doom for everything downwind. The Pathfinders circled, watching their markers take hold, then turned for home. Behind them, the main force was arriving. What happened over the next 2 hours defied the imagination of everyone who witnessed it. The main force bombers came in waves, each aircraft making its individual run over the target area, dropping its load of M69 clusters. The cluster bombs opened at 2,000 feet, scattering hundreds of individual bomblets across the wooden neighborhoods below. When they hit, they did not explode in the traditional sense. They erupted in gouts of napalm flame that instantly ignited everything combustible within yards. In the streets of Shitamachi, people who had been sleeping in their homes woke to the sound of aircraft engines and the clatter of bombs hitting roofs and streets. Then came the fire. The M69s produced flames that could not be fought with conventional methods. Water was useless against napalm. Sand and dirt merely scattered the burning gel, spreading it further. And there were too many fires starting too quickly for any organized response to be effective. The Japanese had prepared for air raids. Tokyo had fire breaks, cleared areas designed to prevent fires from spreading across the city. The government had organized neighborhood civil defense units trained in firefighting. Every household was supposed to maintain buckets of water and sand for emergency use, but none of these preparations were adequate for what was happening. The sheer number of incendiary bombs overwhelmed every defensive measure. Fires that started in one block spread to the next before firefighters could even respond to the first alarm. The fire breaks, often only 30 or 40 feet wide, were jumped by flying embers and radiant heat that ignited buildings on the opposite side before the flames themselves arrived. And then the wind changed everything. The moderate northwest wind that had been blowing when the raid started began to accelerate as the fires grew. The physics of what happened next had been observed in other firestorm raids, but never at this scale. The massive fires created their own weather system. As hundreds of individual blazes merged into larger conflagrations, they heated the air above them to extraordinary temperatures. That hot air rose rapidly, creating a low-pressure zone at ground level. Cooler air rushed in from the sides to replace it, creating winds that fed oxygen to the flames and increased their intensity, which heated the air further, which created more powerful updrafts, which pulled in more air. Within 30 minutes of the first bombs falling, winds at ground level in Shitamachi were reaching 70 miles per hour. These were not the gentle breezes of the original weather forecast. These were gale-force winds created by the fire itself, winds that turned the entire district into a blast furnace. The phenomenon was called a firestorm, and it transformed the raid from a destructive bombing into an apocalyptic event that consumed everything in its path. People tried to flee. They poured into the streets carrying whatever possessions they could grab, heading for the river, for parks, for any open space that might offer refuge from the flames. But the fires were spreading faster than people could run. Families were separated in the chaos. Parents lost children in the smoke and darkness. The elderly and infirm, unable to move quickly, were left behind as the flames advanced. The heat became unbearable. Eyewitness accounts describe temperatures so extreme that people's clothing caught fire from radiant heat alone before the flames themselves reached them. The asphalt in the streets began to melt, trapping people who fell. The canals that crisscrossed the district, which should have offered refuge, became death traps as people jumped into the water seeking relief from the heat. only to discover that the water itself was beginning to boil from the thermal radiation of the surrounding fires. In the air above, the B-29 crews were experiencing their own version of hell. The turbulence created by the rising heat made flying nearly impossible. Aircraft were thrown upward by sudden updrafts, then dropped by equally violent downdrafts. Several bombers were flipped completely inverted by the force of the air currents. Pilots fought their controls, trying to maintain altitude and heading, while their aircraft bucked and rolled like ships in a storm. And the smell. The crews had not expected the smell. At 7,000 feet, with the wind carrying the smoke and gases upward, the interior of the aircraft filled with the stench of burning wood, burning cloth, and burning flesh. Some crewmen vomited into their oxygen masks. Others broke down completely, overwhelmed by the realization of what they were participating in. But they continued to drop their bombs. That was their mission. That was what they had come to do. The fires reached their peak intensity around 2 in the morning. By this point, the individual blazes had merged into a single vast conflagration that covered approximately 16 square miles. The firestorm had become self-sustaining, no longer dependent on the incendiary bombs that had started it. The fire was now feeding on the city itself, consuming block after block of wooden structures that had stood for generations. The temperature at ground level in the center of the firestorm exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, human beings do not burn in the way most people imagine. They are not consumed by flames over minutes or hours. They are incinerated almost instantly, their bodies reduced to ash and bone fragments in seconds. Many of the dead in Shitamachi would never be individually identified because there was simply nothing left to identify. Those who made it to the rivers and canals found that water offered no safety. The bridges over the Sumida River became choke points where thousands of people tried to cross simultaneously, creating crush injuries and panic that killed people before the fire reached them. Some bridges, constructed of wood, caught fire themselves, trapping people between the flames behind them and the water below. Those who jumped into the river often drowned, exhausted from their flight through the burning streets, unable to swim in the current weighted down by whatever possessions they had carried. The Sumida River itself became a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies floated downstream by the term thousands, visible in the reflected glow of the burning city. Some had drowned, some had died from burns before reaching the water, some had simply been overcome by the heat and smoke. The exact number would never be known. The river carried them away, mixing victims from different neighborhoods, different families, different lives, into an anonymous mass of death. In the parks and open spaces, people huddled together, trying to survive the radiant heat that turned refuges into ovens. The Meiji Theatre, a large concrete building that should have offered protection, became a crematorium when thousands of people crowded inside seeking shelter. The fire consumed the oxygen in the air, and the people inside suffocated en masse. Rescuers who entered the building after the flames passed found bodies stacked to the ceiling, people who had climbed over each other desperately seeking breathable air that simply was not there. The last B-29 dropped its bombs at 3:09 in the morning and turned for home. By that point, the raid had officially ended, but the fire had not. The firestorm continued to burn, consuming everything combustible in its path, not stopping until it reached the firebreaks and waterways at the edge of Shitamachi and finally ran out of fuel. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dawn on March 10th revealed a landscape that resembled the surface of another planet. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash and rubble. Where there had been neighborhoods, there were now vast empty spaces, punctuated by the concrete foundations of buildings and the twisted remains of metal infrastructure. Everything wooden, everything combustible, was simply gone. The trees lining the streets were carbonized stumps. The telephone poles had burned away, leaving only the wires lying in tangled heaps on the ground. The human cost was almost beyond calculation. The Tokyo government initially reported 83,793 dead. Subsequent research suggested the actual number was closer to 100,000, possibly higher. Another 1 million people were made homeless. Entire extended families were wiped out, leaving no one to report them missing or claim their remains. Many neighborhoods lost 70, 80, even 90% of their population. The industrial damage was significant. Over 267,000 buildings were destroyed, including thousands of small manufacturing facilities that had been part of Japan's dispersed war production network. But the raid had not distinguished between war production and civilian life, because in Shitamachi the two were inseparable. Homes that had contained family workshops were destroyed, along with homes that contained only families. Children's schools burned alongside small machine shops. The raid had not targeted military objectives in any meaningful sense. It had simply destroyed an entire district of a city, killing everyone who could not escape in time. For the B-29 crews flying home in the early morning light, the mission had been a success by the only measure that mattered to military planners. They had destroyed their target and suffered minimal losses. 14 aircraft were lost out of 334 that reached Tokyo, a loss rate of just over 4%. Compared to the losses on high-altitude raids, this was acceptable. Compared to what they had inflicted on Tokyo, it was negligible. But the psychological cost to the crews was something no one had adequately predicted. These were men who had signed up to fight a war, to bomb military and industrial targets, to contribute to victory over an enemy they believed had to be defeated. They had not necessarily signed up to burn alive 100,000 civilians in a single night. Many crew members would spend the rest of their lives wrestling with what they had done, trying to reconcile their actions with their understanding of themselves as decent human beings. Some found justification in the mathematics of total war. Japan had started the conflict with its attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had committed atrocities across Asia that dwarfed even the Tokyo raid in scale and brutality. Japan showed no signs of surrendering, and intelligence estimates suggested that an invasion of the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, possibly millions of Japanese lives. If incendiary bombing could end the war without an invasion, was it not the moral choice, however terrible the immediate cost? Others could not find such comfort. They had burned women and children alive. They had destroyed homes, not factories. They had participated in what seemed, in the cold light of day, remarkably similar to the very atrocities they were supposedly fighting against. The fact that their side was right did not erase what they had done. The fact that Japan might have done worse did not make their actions good. Curtis LeMay himself never publicly expressed regret for the Tokyo raid or the subsequent firebombing campaign it inaugurated. When asked about the morality of incendiary attacks on Japanese cities, he responded with characteristic bluntness. If the United States had lost the war, he would likely have been tried as a war criminal. But the United States won, and winners are not tried for their methods. This was not precisely an answer to the moral question, but it acknowledged that such a question existed. The Tokyo raid was not a singular event, but the beginning of a campaign. Over the following months, LeMay's bombers would conduct similar incendiary attacks on Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities. By the end of the war, American firebombing would destroy approximately 170 square miles of Japanese urban area and kill between 300,000 and 900,000 civilians, depending on whose estimates you accept. The exact numbers remain disputed to this day, not because of uncertainty about whether the raids happened, but because the destruction was so total that accurate casualty counts became impossible. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 overshadowed the conventional firebombing campaign in historical memory, but in terms of immediate death and destruction, the March 10th Tokyo raid was comparable to either atomic attack. The difference was the method, not the result. The atomic bombs achieved their terrible effects instantly, with a single weapon. The Tokyo raid required hundreds of aircraft and thousands of incendiary bombs, but the outcome for the people on the ground was similar. Their city was destroyed, and they died in massive numbers in a single catastrophic event. Japan did not surrender after Tokyo burned. The firebombing campaign continued through the spring and summer of 1945, destroying city after city, killing tens of thousands more civilians. The Japanese government continued to insist on fighting to the bitter end, mobilizing every resource, training civilians to fight the expected American invasion with bamboo spears if necessary. The calculus of total war had consumed both sides. The Americans were willing to burn Japanese cities to ashes. The Japanese were willing to see their cities burn rather than accept unconditional surrender. It was not until after the atomic bombs, after the Soviet Union's declaration of war, after Emperor Hirohito intervened personally to break the deadlock in his government, that Japan finally surrendered in mid-August of 1945. Even then, some military officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender. So deeply ingrained was the belief that capitulation was unacceptable. In the decades after the war, the question of whether the firebombing campaign was militarily necessary or morally justified became a subject of intense debate. Some historians argue that Japan was already on the verge of collapse by March of 1945, its navy destroyed, its merchant fleet sunk, its access to raw materials from the Asian mainland cut off by American submarines and air power. In this view, the incendiary campaign was unnecessary, a brutal excess that killed hundreds of thousands for no strategic gain. Others contend that without the demonstration of American willingness to destroy Japanese cities, without the psychological shock of such overwhelming destructive power, Japan would never have surrendered short of a costly invasion. In this interpretation, the firebombing campaign, however terrible, actually saved lives by making invasion unnecessary, sparing both the American soldiers who would have died on Japanese beaches and the millions of Japanese civilians who would have perished in the fighting. There is probably no way to resolve this debate definitively. We cannot rerun history to see what would have happened if the firebombing campaign had never occurred. We cannot know with certainty what calculations went through the minds of Japanese leaders as they finally decided to surrender. We can only examine what actually happened and try to understand why. What we do know is that the Tokyo raid of March 10, 1945, represented a fundamental transformation in American warfare. It was the moment when the United States abandoned the pretense that it was conducting precision attacks on military targets and embraced the reality that modern industrial war was total war, that the distinction between combatants and civilians had become meaningless when entire populations were mobilized for war production, when homes and factories sat side by side, when the enemy's will to continue fighting was itself a legitimate military objective. The B-29 seconds that flew over Tokyo that night were equipped with the most advanced technology of their era: pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, sophisticated radar systems capable of identifying targets through clouds and darkness. But they used that technology to drop primitive incendiary bombs on wooden houses, to start fires that consumed human beings by the tens of thousands. The contrast between the sophistication of the delivery system and the crude brutality of the attack itself encapsulates something essential about the Second World War and about modern warfare generally. Technology advances, but the basic reality of war remains. It is about killing people and destroying things until one side can no longer or will no longer continue. For the survivors of the Tokyo raid, life after March 10th was defined by absence. Absence of homes, of possessions, of family members, of entire neighborhoods that had existed for centuries and were now gone. The Japanese government provided minimal support for the homeless and displaced. Resources were scarce in a nation fighting for its survival. People who had lost everything were expected to continue contributing to the war effort, to work in the factories that remained, to grow food in whatever plots of land they could find, to prepare for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. Some survivors left Tokyo, fleeing to the countryside where they had relatives or where they thought they might be safer from further air raids. But most stayed. They had nowhere else to go. They lived in makeshift shelters constructed from the rubble of their former homes, in public buildings that had survived the fire, in the railway stations and underpasses that offered some protection from the elements, if not from bombs. They queued for rations that were increasingly inadequate as Japan's food supply system collapsed under the pressure of the American blockade. They watched the skies, knowing that the bombers would return, that what had happened to Shitamachi would happen again and again until either Japan surrendered or there was nothing left to burn. And they tried to make sense of what had happened to them. Why had the Americans done this? The official government propaganda blamed American barbarism, American racial hatred, American refusal to accept Japan's rightful place in Asia. But some survivors, particularly those who had access to underground information networks or who remembered the pre-war years, understood that this was retaliation, that Japan had started a war it was now losing catastrophically, that the Americans were doing to Tokyo what Japanese bombers had done to Chinese cities, what Japanese soldiers had done to civilians across Asia. This knowledge did not make their suffering easier to bear, but it placed it in a context that pure propaganda could not provide. They were not innocent victims of inexplicable American cruelty. They were casualties of a war their government had chosen to fight, a war that had gone disastrously wrong, a war that was now consuming them as it had consumed so many others across the Pacific and Asia. The physical rebuilding of Tokyo would take decades. The psychological rebuilding would take longer. The scars of March 10, 1945, remained visible in Japanese society and memory long after the rubble was cleared and new buildings rose where Shitamachi had stood. The survivors carried their trauma with them, passing it to their children and grandchildren in the form of nightmares, silences, and a deep-seated fear of fire that persisted even in the rebuilt, modern city. For the American crew members who flew that night, the trauma was different but no less real. They had done their duty. They had followed orders. They had contributed to victory in a war that had to be won. But they had also killed more people in a single night than most soldiers kill in entire careers. They had participated in an act of destruction so vast it challenged their ability to comprehend it, let alone justify it. Some crew members never spoke about the Tokyo raid to their families. It was too painful, too morally ambiguous, too difficult to explain to people who had not been there. How do you tell your children that you burned a city? How do you explain that it seemed necessary at the time, that there were reasons, that the enemy was terrible too, that war makes monsters of everyone? Some found it easier to simply not speak of it at all, to carry the weight silently and alone. Others spoke about it constantly, compulsively, trying through repetition to make sense of the senseless, to find some moral clarity in the fog of total war. They gave interviews to historians. They wrote memoirs. They attended reunions where they could talk with the only other people who truly understood what they had experienced. But even then, the clarity they sought remained elusive. The Tokyo raid remained what it had always been, a necessary evil, a terrible mistake, a justified atrocity, or simply an event beyond moral categories, depending on who was doing the judging and from what distance in time. The technical lessons of the Tokyo raid were absorbed immediately into American air doctrine. The effectiveness of low-altitude incendiary attacks against Japanese cities was undeniable. LeMay's tactics had worked. The strategic bombing campaign that had been faltering at high altitude became devastatingly effective once the bombers came down low and switched to fire. Within weeks, similar raids were being planned and executed against other Japanese cities. The formula was refined: pathfinders to mark the target, main force to drop the incendiaries, individual aircraft approach to saturate defenses, night operations to reduce losses from fighters. But the deeper lessons about the nature of strategic bombing and its moral implications would take much longer to process. The Tokyo raid forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about modern warfare. It revealed that the distinction between military and civilian targets, which had seemed so important in American bombing doctrine, was largely rhetorical when applied to total industrial war. It demonstrated that technology designed for precision could just as easily be used for area destruction. And it showed that democracies fighting for their survival could commit acts that, in any other context, would be recognized as atrocities. These were not lessons that military planners or political leaders wanted to acknowledge publicly. The official narrative, both during and after the war, emphasized the military necessity of the bombing campaign, its contribution to ending the war, its role in preventing a costly invasion. The civilian casualties were regrettable but unavoidable collateral damage in a just war against a brutal enemy. This narrative was not entirely false, it was simply incomplete. The complete story includes the 100,000 people who burned to death in Tokyo on March 10th. It includes the million people made homeless. It includes the families destroyed, the children orphaned, the elderly abandoned to die in the flames. It includes the psychological cost to the American crews who delivered the destruction. And it includes the question that no amount of strategic analysis can definitively answer: was it worth it? Different people answer that question differently, and the answer often depends less on the historical facts than on the moral framework through which those facts are interpreted. If you believe that winning the war justified any means that contributed to victory, then the Tokyo raid was justified. If you believe that certain actions are wrong, regardless of their strategic utility, then it was not. If you believe that morality itself becomes meaningless in the context of total war between industrial societies, then the question is unanswerable. What cannot be disputed is what actually happened. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 334 American B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo with incendiary weapons. They flew low, below 10,000 feet, dropping their bombs visually rather than relying primarily on radar. They created a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the city and killed approximately 100,000 people in 6 hours. It was one of the most destructive air raids in history, more immediately lethal than either atomic bombing that would follow 5 months later. The raid demonstrated that the most advanced bomber aircraft ever built, equipped with cutting-edge radar and navigation technology, could be most effectively employed by flying low and dropping primitive firebombs on wooden houses. This paradox encapsulates something essential about the Tokyo raid and about the Second World War generally: technological sophistication in service of primal destruction, modern industrial capability deployed to achieve effects that would have been familiar to ancient armies burning cities to the ground. The survivors of March 10th carried their memories for the rest of their lives, telling their stories when they could bear to, remaining silent when they could not. The American crew members did the same. And historians continue to debate the raid's necessity, its morality, and its place in the larger narrative of the war. But the fundamental facts remain unchanged. It happened, it was devastating, and it represented a choice made by human beings to destroy a city and everyone in it who could not escape in time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.